December 19, 1944. Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The freezing dawn breaks over snow-covered hills as a tattered American convoy limps through narrow forest roads. The temperature hovers at 12 degrees below zero. Frost forms on metal, on cloth, on skin. Exhausted men huddle in half-tracks and jeeps, their eyes scanning the tree line for movement. 6 days into what will later be called the Battle of the Bulge, the Allied lines have fractured like ice on a frozen pond. The German offensive, a desperate gamble by Hitler to split the Allied forces, has succeeded beyond Wehrmacht expectations. American units find themselves isolated, communication lines severed, commanders killed or missing. Sergeant Francis Curry, a 20-year-old Sherman gunner from Selkirk, New York, sits atop his tank, eyes burning from lack of sleep, fingers numb despite woolen gloves. His unit, Company K, 358th Infantry Regiment, has been ordered to fall back to St. Vith, abandoning positions they've held for 36 hours against waves of German armor. Dawn light catches on the barrel of Curry's Thompson submachine gun, a weapon he wasn't supposed to have, but had taken from a wounded officer 2 days earlier. His tank commander, Lieutenant Robert Mitchell, studies a creased map with a flashlight, cupped in frozen hands. "We've got 11 miles to St. Vith," Mitchell says, his breath crystallizing. "Intelligence says Piper's panzer units are sweeping north. If we move now, we might avoid engagement." Curry nods, but something about the lieutenant's assessment troubles him. The intelligence reports are 12 hours old. The radio has been silent for 4. The only certainty is uncertainty. As the convoy prepares to move, Curry notices something that makes his blood freeze colder than the Belgian winter. Fresh tank tracks in the snow, cutting perpendicular to their planned route. Wide tracks, German tracks, and they're heading toward a village that doesn't appear on their maps, but which local Belgian resistance fighters had told them housed over 100 American prisoners in a stone compound. While Lieutenant Mitchell plots their withdrawal route, Curry makes a decision that will later be described by war correspondents as either the bravest or most foolhardy act of the campaign. He decides not to retreat. Not yet. Not while American POWs might be directly in the path of advancing German armor. What happens next will challenge every conventional understanding of battlefield tactics and individual capability under the most extreme conditions of modern warfare. Dawn breaks fully as the convoy splits. Mitchell leads the main force towards St. Vith, while Curry, convincing 4 other men to join him, follows the German tracks toward the unmarked village. They move quietly through the forest, 5 men against what intelligence suggests could be an entire panzer company. The snow deadens their footsteps as they advance through a landscape transformed by war. Splintered trees, abandoned equipment, occasional dark stains in the snow that no one acknowledges. 2 miles in, they hear it. The unmistakable rumble of German Tiger tanks. Not the higher-pitched sound of their own Shermans, but the deeper, more menacing growl of heavier German armor. Cresting a small ridge, Curry sees what they're facing. 12 German tanks, a mix of Tigers and Panthers, have surrounded a stone farmhouse complex on the outskirts of a small Belgian village. Through his binoculars, he can see American uniforms inside. The intelligence was correct. Over 100 American prisoners are being held in the compound, now encircled by enough German firepower to obliterate the stone buildings in minutes. Private James Holcomb, a farm boy from Nebraska who'd celebrated his 19th birthday 3 days earlier, whispers what they're all thinking. "What exactly is your plan here, Sarge? There's 5 of us and 12 tanks." Curry doesn't answer immediately. Conventional military doctrine provides no solution for their situation. 5 infantry soldiers against 12 armored vehicles represents suicide by any tactical calculation. But Curry sees something in the German tank formation that others might miss. A vulnerability born of overconfidence. The German tanks have positioned themselves in a way that suggests they don't expect resistance. They've prioritized covering all escape routes from the farmhouse rather than maintaining defensive positions against external threats. Their attention is focused inward on the prisoners, not outward toward potential attackers. It's a mistake born of tactical arrogance, the belief that no American forces would be advancing toward the German offensive rather than retreating from it. Curry formulates a plan so unorthodox that military strategists will later study it as an example of asymmetric warfare under impossible conditions. "I need every anti-tank grenade we've got," he tells his small team, "and the bazooka, all rounds." Private Michael Kovac, their demolition specialist, opens his pack to reveal 6 anti-tank grenades and 4 bazooka rounds. Not enough for 12 tanks under any conventional scenario. Not nearly enough. But Francis Curry isn't thinking conventionally. "They don't know we're here," he says, sketching a quick diagram in the snow. "They're focused on the prisoners. If we can take out the command tank, that one, with the officer standing in the turret, we create confusion. Use that confusion to hit the rear tanks blocking the south exit. Create an escape route for the prisoners. Use the chaos to maximize damage to their armor." Corporal Thomas Hayes, the oldest of them at 23, looks skeptical. "That's not a plan, Sarge. That's a suicide note." Curry meets his gaze steadily. "Got a better idea? We leave. Those men die. Simple as that." No one argues further. They distribute their meager anti-tank weapons and prepare to attack 12 German tanks, with what amounts to little more than personal courage and tactical surprise. At precisely 7:15 a.m., as a German officer stands atop the lead Tiger tank, gesturing toward the farmhouse, Francis Curry fires the first shot. His borrowed Thompson catches the German commander in the chest, dropping him back into his turret like a puppet with cut strings. For 3 critical seconds, nothing happens. 3 seconds of stunned silence as the Germans process that they're under attack. 3 seconds that Curry and his men use to maximum advantage. Kovac fires the bazooka at the rearmost Panther, hitting its thinly armored rear engine compartment. The tank doesn't explode dramatically as in Hollywood films. Instead, it begins smoking heavily, its engine disabled. Simultaneously, Curry and Hayes sprint between trees at the forest edge, hurling anti-tank grenades at the treads of 2 Tigers positioned side by side. The explosions aren't powerful enough to destroy the tanks, but they damage the treads, immobilizing the massive vehicles where they stand. Then chaos erupts. The remaining German tanks begin rotating their turrets, searching for threats in all directions. Machine gun fire rakes the forest edge. The sounds of tank engines revving fills the air as commanders try to reposition their now vulnerable formation. This is the chaos Curry had anticipated, the critical window when 5 men might actually stand a chance against overwhelming armor. What military historians would later call the Ardennes anomaly unfolds over the next 27 minutes. Curry and his small team use the forest as cover, appearing at different positions, creating the illusion of a much larger attacking force. They employ hit-and-run tactics, striking vulnerable points on the German tanks, vision slits, engine compartments, tread assemblies, then disappearing into the trees before counterfire can find them. Private Holcomb, the farm boy from Nebraska, displays an uncanny ability to hit tank vision blocks with his rifle, temporarily blinding drivers and forcing them to open hatches to navigate, creating additional vulnerability that Curry exploits. When their anti-tank grenades are exhausted, Curry improvises. He locates an abandoned German Panzerfaust, a single-shot anti-tank weapon, near a dead Wehrmacht soldier at the forest edge. Though unfamiliar with the German weapon, he quickly deciphers its operation and uses it to disable a 4th tank. Inside the farmhouse compound, the American prisoners realize something extraordinary is happening. Through windows and cracks in the stone walls, they see their captors thrown into disarray by attackers they cannot locate or quantify. Technical Sergeant William Harrison, the senior NCO among the prisoners, begins quietly organizing the men. "Be ready to move," he whispers. "Someone's giving us a chance." 20 minutes into the engagement, the German tank formation has completely broken down. 4 tanks are immobilized or disabled. The remaining 8 have pulled back into defensive positions, their commanders no longer concerned with guarding prisoners, but focused entirely on surviving what they believe is a coordinated American counterattack with anti-tank units. Radio transmissions intercepted later revealed that the German commander reported being attacked by at least 2 companies with heavy anti-tank weaponry. It's at this moment that Curry takes his most daring gamble. With the German tanks distracted and partially withdrawn, he sprints across 200 yards of open ground to the farmhouse wall. German machine gun fire follows him, kicking up snow, but misses. He reaches the stone wall and locates a window where he can communicate with the prisoners inside. "South exit is opening up," he tells Sergeant Harrison through the window. "When I create a diversion on the north side, Get your men out through the south. There's a forest trail that leads west towards St. Vith. Follow it 5 miles, you'll hit our lines. Harrison looks at the young sergeant with disbelief. How many men do you have out there, soldier? Curry doesn't hesitate or embellish. 4 others, all infantry. The disbelief on Harrison's face deepens. You attacked 12 German tanks with 5 men? Curry simply nods. We needed to create a window for you. It won't stay open long. Creating the promised diversion requires Curry to take a risk that even his own men consider borderline suicidal. He locates an abandoned American half-track at the north edge of the compound, likely used to transport the prisoners originally. Though damaged, its .50 caliber machine gun remains operational, as his 4 teammates maintain sporadic fire from the forest edge to keep German attention divided. Curry reaches the half-track and mans the heavy machine gun. The .50 caliber isn't designed as an anti-tank weapon. Against the frontal armor of a Tiger tank, it's practically useless. But Curry isn't aiming to destroy tanks. He's creating an impression, the illusion of a heavy weapons team joining the attack from a new direction. He opens fire on the nearest Tigers, deliberately targeting vision blocks, open hatches, and external equipment. The psychological impact is immediate. The German tanks on the north side of the compound begin rotating to address this new threat, pulling attention away from the south exit. Inside the farmhouse, Sergeant Harrison sees the opening. "Move now," he orders, and 117 American prisoners begin streaming out the south exit, running in small groups toward the forest edge, where Kovacs and Holcomb wait to guide them. The evacuation happens with remarkable speed, a testament to military discipline, even among exhausted prisoners. Within 7 minutes, all prisoners are clear of the compound, moving along the forest trail toward American lines. But Francis Curry remains exposed at the half-track, maintaining his diversion to cover the escape. German infantry, previously unseen, begin advancing on his position. Tank turrets rotate back toward him as radio communication among the German units clarifies what's happening. Curry stays at the machine gun until the last possible moment, only abandoning the position when a tank shell obliterates the front of the half-track, missing him by inches. What follows is a fighting withdrawal that will later be taught at military academies as a textbook example of how to break contact with a superior force. Curry rejoins his small team and the freed prisoners in the forest, organizing them into a defensive formation despite their lack of weapons. They move west along forest trails, using hit-and-run tactics when German infantry pursues them, creating ambushes with minimal armament, maximizing the defensive advantages of the dense Ardennes forest. By mid-afternoon, the combined group, 5 rescuers and 117 rescued, reaches the American lines near St. Vith. Lieutenant Mitchell, who had led the main convoy to safety earlier, stares in disbelief as Curry walks into the command post, followed by the men he'd written off as lost. "We expected 1 Sherman and 5 men, Mitchell says. "You bring us an entire company of infantry." Curry's response, recorded by a war correspondent present at St. Vith, becomes one of the most understated battlefield reports of the war. "Encountered enemy armor, neutralized the threat, recovered our personnel." When pressed for details about how 5 men had supposedly neutralized 12 German tanks and freed over 100 prisoners, Curry redirects credit to his team and the prisoners themselves. "Americans don't leave Americans behind. We just created an opportunity. They did the rest." Military intelligence officers debrief Curry and his team for 7 hours, struggling to reconcile their account with what should have been tactically impossible. How had 5 lightly armed infantrymen effectively neutralized a German heavy tank company? The answer emerges gradually through analysis of German communications intercepted during the engagement. The Germans had been victim of what military theorists now call threat multiplication, the perception of a larger opposing force created through mobility, unconventional tactics, and exploitation of psychological warfare principles. Colonel James Winters, commanding the defensive position at St. Vith, initially dismisses the account as battlefield exaggeration, but as confirmation arrives from multiple sources, the freed prisoners, German communications, reconnaissance reports showing disabled German tanks at the village, the full scope of what Curry and his team accomplished becomes clear. The 5 men hadn't physically destroyed 12 tanks. They had tactically neutralized them through a combination of actual damage, psychological warfare, and exploitation of conventional military doctrine's blind spots. For military planners, the incident challenges fundamental assumptions about armor vulnerability and infantry capability. 4 days after the rescue, German forces capture the village where the engagement occurred. They recover their disabled tanks, repair what can be salvaged, and continue their offensive. But the tactical delay created by Curry's action, combined with the rescue of specialized personnel among the prisoners, including several signals intelligence officers with critical knowledge of Allied communication systems, has strategic consequences disproportionate to the small scale of the engagement. The story might have remained a minor footnote in the larger Battle of the Bulge narrative, if not for the presence of that war correspondent at St. Vith. His account, published first in Stars and Stripes and then syndicated to American newspapers, captures public imagination. In an atmosphere of anxiety about the German offensive, Curry's exploit becomes a symbol of American determination and ingenuity against overwhelming odds. In London, General Eisenhower's strategic planning staff studies the incident for broader tactical lessons. What Curry intuitively understood, that armored units have psychological vulnerabilities that can be exploited by infantry under the right circumstances, influences modifications to anti-tank training protocols across Allied forces. The Ardennes method, as some instructors informally call it, emphasizes creating confusion within tank formations rather than attempting direct destruction when conventional anti-tank weapons are unavailable. Francis Curry returns to combat 3 days after reaching St. Vith, rejoining his original Sherman crew as they participate in the American counteroffensive. His commander, Lieutenant Mitchell, approaches tank warfare with new perspective, incorporating lessons from Curry's infantry experience into their armored operations. Their tank, nicknamed Belgian Bulldog after the incident, develops a reputation for tactical flexibility that combines the strengths of both armor and infantry approaches. By January 8, 1945, as Allied forces regain ground lost during the German offensive, military intelligence confirms a remarkable detail. The German tank company Curry encountered had been part of Kampfgruppe Peiper, an elite battle group led by SS officer Joachim Peiper, responsible for the Malmedy massacre of American prisoners days earlier. The prisoners Curry rescued had likely been destined for a similar fate. This revelation transforms the tactical significance of the engagement into a moral victory as well. American ingenuity and courage directly countering one of the war's most notorious war crimes. Joachim Peiper, debriefed by German High Command about battlefield setbacks during the offensive, specifically mentions the engagement at the Belgian village as evidence of new American anti-tank tactics we have not previously encountered. The psychological impact of Curry's action extends beyond the immediate tactical situation, creating uncertainty among German armor commanders about potential vulnerabilities in their operations. Technical analysis, conducted by ordnance specialists, reveals that Curry's team had caused significantly less actual damage than the Germans reported. Of 12 tanks, only 3 suffered mechanical disablement, requiring major repair. The others experienced what military analysts now call mission kill, neutralization without destruction, where psychological factors and minor damage combine to render a weapon system operationally ineffective despite its continued technical functionality. Colonel Winters, initially skeptical of Curry's account, becomes an advocate for integrating the tactical lessons from the engagement into broader military doctrine. What these 5 men accomplished wasn't about weapons or equipment, he writes in an after-action analysis. It was about understanding that armor, for all its physical invulnerability, operates within psychological parameters that can be manipulated. They didn't defeat 12 tanks, they defeated 12 tank crews. The freed prisoners, many of whom had specialized technical or intelligence roles, returned to their units carrying both the practical experience of their rescue and something less tangible but equally valuable: the knowledge that American forces would attempt seemingly impossible operations to recover their personnel. This moral certainty influences operational courage throughout the remainder of the European campaign, with measurable effects on unit cohesion and battlefield performance. On February 12, 1945, a German officer captured near Colmar makes a statement during interrogation that catches the attention of intelligence analysts. After the Ardennes, he says, our tank commanders became hesitant in forested terrain. They began seeing American anti-tank teams behind every tree. One incident created a phantom that haunted our operations for weeks afterward. He doesn't specify the incident, but the timing and description align perfectly with Curry's action. Military historians examining the Battle of the Bulge identified turning points large and small that contributed to the ultimate failure of Hitler's offensive. Most focus on major engagements like the defense of Bastogne or the relief operations that broke the German advance. But in classified analyses, strategic planners acknowledge the cumulative effect of smaller actions, the Curry incident among them, that created psychological friction within German command structures, undermining their offensive tempo and operational confidence. Private Holcomb, the Nebraska farm boy whose precision rifle fire had blinded German tank drivers during the engagement, received specialized sniper training afterward. His after-action report becomes case study material at infantry schools, demonstrating how conventional weapons can be employed in unconventional roles against armored threats. His technique for targeting vision blocks, striking repeatedly at the same point to create stress fractures in the bulletproof glass, becomes standard procedure in anti-tank infantry training. In March 1945, as Allied forces crossed the Rhine into Germany, Francis Curry encounters one of the prisoners his team rescued. Captain Edward Lansing had been among the signals intelligence officers held at the Belgian farmhouse. Now, as their units temporarily share a command post during the advance into Germany, Lansing reveals something he hadn't known during the engagement. Those prisoners you saved, 3 of them had complete knowledge of our new encryption protocols. If the Germans had broken them, he doesn't finish the sentence, he doesn't need to. Both men understand the strategic vulnerability that had been neutralized through their tactical action. The broader principles demonstrated during the engagement influence post-war military thinking in ways that extend beyond anti-tank tactics. The concept that small determined forces can effectively neutralize technologically superior opponents through asymmetric approaches eventually evolves into formal doctrine. Special operations units study the incident as an example of how conventional forces can employ unconventional methods when circumstances require. At the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College, the Curry scenario becomes a standard tactical problem presented to officer candidates. Given the parameters of 5 infantry soldiers against 12 tanks protecting a prisoner compound, how would they approach the situation? Most conventional tactical solutions fail. The exercise demonstrates that military problems sometimes require solutions outside doctrinal boundaries, challenging the rigid tactical thinking that sometimes characterizes conventional military education. For the German High Command, the incident contributes to a reassessment of armored vulnerability that influences their defensive planning during the final months of the European campaign. Armored units receive modified tactical directives emphasizing infantry support and counter-ambush procedures. The psychological impact of the engagement extends far beyond its direct tactical outcome, creating operational adjustments disproportionate to the actual damage inflicted. After the war, military analysts from multiple nations study what became known as the Ardennes anomaly, the tactical defeat of armored units by significantly inferior forces through psychological means rather than physical destruction. Soviet military theorists particularly focus on the incident as evidence that Western tanks operate with psychological vulnerabilities that could be exploited in potential future conflicts. Their analysis influences the development of anti-tank tactics that emphasize creating confusion and psychological pressure rather than relying solely on destructive capability. Francis Curry returns to civilian life after the war with little fanfare, working as a counselor at a Veterans Administration hospital where his battlefield experiences provide unique insight into combat trauma. When interviewed about the incident years later, he consistently emphasizes the team aspect of the engagement rather than his individual role. "We saw a problem that needed solving," he says simply. "Conventional approaches weren't available, so we improvised." The Belgian village where the engagement occurred builds a small monument after the war, not to the tactical achievement, but to the humanitarian outcome. The inscription, translated from French, reads, "Here courage overcame power, and humanity prevailed over circumstance." Local residents who witnessed the engagement from hiding places within the village share stories that become regional folklore, sometimes embellished but capturing the essential truth of what 5 determined men accomplished against overwhelming odds. Military technology evolves in the decades following World War II, with tanks developing increasingly sophisticated defense systems against conventional anti-tank weapons. Yet, tactical analysis of historical engagements continues to highlight the Curry factor, the vulnerability of even the most advanced weapon systems to unconventional approaches that exploit psychological and operational weaknesses rather than attempting direct physical defeat. Lieutenant Mitchell, Curry's tank commander, later becomes an instructor at the armor school at Fort Knox, where he incorporates lessons from the Ardennes incident into training programs. "Armor is not invulnerable," becomes his mantra to students. Not physically, not operationally, not psychologically. Understanding this makes you a better tank commander, whether you're inside the tank or facing it on the battlefield. The tactical principles demonstrated during the engagement find expression in post-war military concepts across multiple domains. Naval theorists study the incident for parallels to asymmetric threats against capital ships. Air defense planners consider the implications for psychological vulnerabilities in air defense networks. The fundamental insight that perceived threats can create effects equivalent to actual threats under the right circumstances influences military thinking well beyond the specific anti-tank scenario. Captain Lansing, the signals intelligence officer rescued during the engagement, eventually joins the newly formed Central Intelligence Agency, where he advocates for operational approaches that emphasize psychological leverage over direct confrontation. In classified papers, he occasionally references the Ardennes lesson when arguing for unconventional approaches to seemingly intractable intelligence problems. His first-hand experience with how 5 determined individuals overcame overwhelming odds through psychological insight rather than physical force shapes, an institutional perspective that influences early Cold War operations. Private Kovacs, the demolition specialist whose precise placement of their limited anti-tank weapons had been crucial to the engagement's success, becomes an explosives engineer in civilian life. Working on construction projects across America during the post-war building boom, he occasionally recognizes how principles from that desperate Belgian morning apply to seemingly unrelated engineering problems. "It's never about how much explosive you have," he tells apprentices. "It's about where you place it and when you trigger it." Corporal Hayes, initially the most skeptical about Curry's plan, writes an unpublished memoir titled "The Day We Should Have Died," detailing how conventional military thinking would have doomed them had they followed standard tactical doctrine. Though never published commercially, copies circulate informally among military professionals, valued for their candid assessment of how battlefield innovation occurs under extreme pressure. The German tank commanders involved in the engagement have their own perspective, revealed years later through interviews conducted by military historians. Oberleutnant Friedrich Werner, commanding one of the Panthers, describes the psychological disintegration that occurred within the tank formation. "We began the engagement with absolute confidence in our tactical superiority," he recalls. Within minutes, that confidence transformed into confusion, then concern, then something approaching panic. Not because we were being destroyed, but because we could not locate or quantify what was threatening us. Uncertainty became a more effective weapon against us than any anti-tank gun. Francis Curry's intuitive understanding of this psychological dimension represents his most significant contribution to the engagement's outcome. Without formal training in psychological warfare or advanced tactical theory, he recognized instinctively that creating an impression of threat could be as effective as creating actual destruction under the right circumstances. This insight, born of battlefield necessity rather than academic study, anticipates military concepts that would later be formalized in doctrinal developments across multiple nations. The prisoners rescued during the engagement include individuals whose contributions to the Allied war effort extend far beyond their personal survival. Among them, 3 signals intelligence officers, 7 cryptographic specialists, and numerous technical experts whose knowledge, had it been extracted through interrogation, would have compromised operations across the European theater. The strategic impact of their recovery cannot be measured in conventional tactical terms, creating ripple effects through multiple operational domains. After-action analysis conducted by Allied intelligence identifies another dimension to the engagement's significance. German communication intercepts reveal that the tank company Currie encountered had been scheduled to reinforce Kampfgruppe Piper's spearhead units later that day. Their delay and subsequent repair requirements kept them from this assigned role during a critical 24-hour window when Piper's advance was stalled by fuel shortages. While impossible to quantify precisely, this operational delay potentially influenced the ultimate failure of the German breakthrough attempt. For the residents of St. Vith, who received the freed prisoners and their 5 rescuers on that December afternoon, the incident becomes a symbol of resistance against seemingly overwhelming force. As their town changes hands multiple times during the battle's subsequent days, the story circulates as evidence that the German offensive, for all its initial success, lacks the decisive advantage needed for strategic victory. The psychological impact within the civilian population influences their interactions with both Allied and German forces, creating an operational environment that subtly favors American efforts. Military planners studying the engagement recognize a pattern that appears in other successful asymmetric actions throughout military history: the exploitation of the assumption gap that often exists between opposing forces. The German tank commanders assumed that any American force in the area would be retreating, not advancing. They assumed that infantry without heavy anti-tank weapons posed no significant threat. They assumed that conventional tactical doctrine would dictate their opponent's behavior. Francis Currie and his team exploited each of these assumptions to create an outcome that should have been tactically impossible. In the development of post-war special operations capability, the Ardennes model influences training methodologies that emphasize creating tactical dilemmas for superior forces through unexpected approaches. The fundamental question, how can limited resources be employed to neutralize superior capability, finds partial answer in studying how 5 determined men effectively neutralized 12 German tanks without proportionate weaponry or numerical advantage. Tactical innovation rarely emerges from comfortable circumstances. The desperate conditions of the Ardennes offensive, with American forces overextended and under-resourced, created an environment where conventional approaches proved insufficient. Francis Currie's willingness to abandon tactical orthodoxy when the situation demanded represents a form of battlefield adaptation that military organizations continuously seek to institutionalize but struggle to formalize. How do you train soldiers to know when rules should be broken and orthodoxy abandoned? The Ardennes anomaly provides a case study without offering easy answers. The freed prisoners, returning to their units across the front, carry with them an operational narrative that influences morale disproportionate to the tactical scale of the engagement. For troops experiencing the psychological pressure of the German offensive, the story provides evidence that American ingenuity and determination can overcome seemingly impossible odds. This morale effect, while impossible to quantify in conventional military terms, creates measurable impact on unit cohesion and operational resilience during the critical weeks of the Allied counteroffensive. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Stumpf, a battalion commander who debriefs Currie after the incident, recognizes implications beyond immediate tactical lessons. "What happened that morning challenges our fundamental understanding of combat power," he writes in a confidential assessment. "We quantify capability in terms of weapons, equipment, numbers, measurable factors. But this engagement demonstrates that psychological factors, initiative, surprise, uncertainty, can temporarily transform actual combat power ratios in ways our doctrinal calculations don't account for." For Francis Currie, the incident represents not a revolutionary tactical insight, but simply the application of common sense to an urgent human problem. When interviewed by Army historians in 1962, he expresses surprise at the continued military interest in the engagement. "We saw Americans who needed help," he says. "We had limited resources but a good position. We used what we had where it would make the most difference, that's all." This straightforward assessment belies the complexity that military analysts continue to find in studying the tactical and psychological dimensions of what his small team accomplished. The Ardennes anomaly enters military educational curricula across multiple nations in the post-war era, though often without identifying the specific historical incident. Soviet tactical manuals include scenarios clearly modeled on the engagement, teaching commanders to recognize and counter the psychological vulnerabilities that Curry intuitively exploited. British infantry doctrine incorporates lessons about creating tactical dilemmas for armor through mobility and surprise rather than direct confrontation. American special operations training uses the incident as a case study in asymmetric advantage creation. The tangible outcomes of the engagement, 4 German tanks disabled, 117 prisoners freed, fail to capture its strategic significance. Military historians examining the Battle of the Bulge identify critical moments when German momentum faltered for reasons that conventional tactical analysis struggles to explain. The cumulative effect of actions like Curry's, which created operational friction within German formations disproportionate to actual combat losses, contributed to the offensive's ultimate failure in ways that transcend conventional metrics of battlefield success. On the 50th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge, historians interviewing surviving participants note a pattern in how German veterans describe the engagement's later phases. Many reference a growing uncertainty about American capabilities and intentions, a psychological dimension that influenced tactical decision-making at multiple levels. While impossible to attribute to any single incident, the Ardennes anomaly and similar actions contributed to this cumulative effect, creating an operational environment where German commanders increasingly hesitated when confronted with tactical uncertainty. Francis Curry's intuitive grasp of how to maximize limited resources against superior capability represents a form of tactical genius that military organizations continuously seek to identify and develop in their personnel. The challenge lies not in recognizing its value, but in creating institutional frameworks that encourage such innovation without undermining necessary tactical discipline. The engagement provides no easy answers to this persistent military dilemma, but offers a compelling case study in how individual initiative can transform seemingly impossible tactical situations. For the village residents who witness the engagement from hiding, the experience transforms their understanding of warfare in ways that influence regional memory long after the conflict ends. Local accounts emphasize not the military dimension, but the moral significance, how determination and courage overcame seemingly insurmountable odds to prevent what they later learn would likely have been a massacre of prisoners. This human dimension, often overlooked in formal military analysis, represents perhaps the most significant legacy of what occurred that December morning. In the evolution of military thought, the incident contributes to a broader reassessment of asymmetric warfare principles that influences doctrine development across multiple nations. The fundamental question, how limited forces can effectively confront superior capability, finds partial answer in studying engagements where conventional power relationships were temporarily inverted through unconventional approaches. Francis Curry's action, while unique in its specifics, exemplifies a pattern that military theorists continue to analyze for applicable lessons across diverse operational contexts. The strategic impact of the engagement extends beyond its immediate tactical outcome. Among the freed prisoners, several possessed technical knowledge and operational information that, had it been extracted through interrogation, would have compromised Allied capabilities across multiple domains. The German offensive, already operating on a precarious logistical and operational timeline, loses critical intelligence opportunities that might have influenced key decisions during subsequent phases of the battle. For military educators, the incident provides valuable teaching material, precisely because it defies easy categorization within conventional tactical frameworks. It demonstrates how battlefield reality frequently transcends doctrinal boundaries, requiring adaptability and innovation that formal military education struggles to institutionalize. How do you train soldiers to recognize when orthodoxy has become obstacle? The engagement offers a case study that raises this question without providing definitive answers. In the development of post-war special operations capabilities, planners study the incident for transferable principles that might apply to emerging Cold War scenarios. The fundamental insight, that perceived threats can create effects equivalent to actual threats under certain circumstances, influences operational concepts that emphasize psychological impact over direct confrontation. The threat multiplication effect that Curry's team achieved becomes a principle that special operations units seek to replicate in diverse operational contexts. Military technology evolves dramatically in the decades following World War II, transforming the specific tactical parameters that defined the Ardennes engagement. Yet the psychological principles demonstrated during those 27 minutes retain their relevance across technological generations. Modern armored vehicles, for all their advanced capabilities, remain operated by humans, subject to the same psychological pressures that influenced German tank crews that December morning. Francis Curry returns to Selkirk, New York after the war, working quietly as a VA counselor until retirement. When occasionally asked about the incident by military historians or journalists, he consistently emphasizes the team dimension over his individual role. "5 of us saw a problem that needed solving," becomes his standard response. "We each contributed what we could." This understated assessment characterizes a generation's approach to extraordinary accomplishment, a matter-of-fact acceptance of having done what necessity required, regardless of conventional expectations or limitations. The Belgian village where the engagement occurred becomes a minor historical site in the broader landscape of Battle of the Bulge remembrance. A small marker, erected by local residents rather than official commemoration, notes simply, "Here on December 19, 1944, 5 American soldiers demonstrated that courage and ingenuity can overcome superior force." The modesty of the memorial reflects the nature of the engagement itself, not a famous battle but a moment when individual determination temporarily rewrote the conventional rules of modern warfare. Military analysts studying the engagement decades later identify elements that transcend its specific historical context. The tactical principles demonstrated: mobility creating the illusion of greater numbers, psychological pressure amplifying actual capability, selective targeting of vulnerabilities rather than attempting comprehensive destruction, find application across diverse operational scenarios. What 5 determined men accomplished against 12 German tanks that December morning continues to inform how military organizations understand the complex relationship between actual and effective combat power. The freed prisoners, returning to their units with first-hand experience of how conventional tactical limitations can be overcome through unconventional approaches, carry this perspective into subsequent operations. Several become instructors after the war, incorporating lessons from their rescue into training programs that emphasize adaptability and innovation under adverse conditions. The engagement's influence extends through these personal connections, creating institutional memory that survives long after formal reports are archived. For Francis Curry, the most significant outcome of the incident isn't measured in military terms, but in human ones. 117 men who might otherwise have been killed returned to their families after the war. Communities that might have received telegrams announcing sons and husbands lost instead welcomed them home. This human dimension, impossible to quantify in conventional military analysis, represents the true significance of what 5 determined men accomplished against impossible odds on a freezing December morning in the Ardennes forest.